Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself astray in a dark wood where the straight road had been lost. These are the opening lines of the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, the finest work in the Italian language written in the 14th century by Dante Alighieri, also called Il Sommo Poeta, the supreme poet. In the middle of the journey of his life, Dante finds himself lost in a dark wood, and he cannot find the straight path. He cannot remember how he wandered away from his true path that he should be following. But he is in a fearful place, impenetrable and wild. The opening lines suggest first a realistic journey through a strange and eerie place. But after the first three lines, it's apparent that everything will be in terms of an allegory. It's a story of Dante's journey through life to salvation. In its simplest terms, man can often become so involved with the day-to-day affairs of simply living that he will gradually relapse into a sort of lethargy in which he strays from true paths. Welcome to the latest floating poetry broadcast, and thank you for leaning in to the 66th show in my ongoing weekly series, coming to you live on the green wooded edge of a reservation, Antaka Brook, where I've spent time past. That was once home to the Lenape tribe and is part of the Great Swamp, the second largest wildlife refuge after the Everglades. Here in the countrified, old colonial era county seat of Morristown, New Jersey. This is your poet and poetorialist, Colin Goedecke, a voice for living our days more poetically, more expressively, more soulfully. Last week we came to a poetic buffet or smorgasbord of kinds, of many expressions of love and appreciation of and relationships with food, cooking, and feasting. This week, I thought I'd take us, through the forests and gardens of our lives, literally, literarily, and metaphorically, and otherwise. For they are each and both full of their own deeper beauties, mysteries, and wisdoms, and to me are relevant to a greater understanding of our own beings and ways of living, and how to relate in more conscious and caring ways with them, with nature so wildly alive around us. So, if you're ready to move through an outer and inner world of gardens and forests, from resonant thoughts and anecdotes to cultural commentary and a free-form curation of poetry, let's make our way there together. Let me pay homage to this place that I mentioned, Antaka. It's a very short walk away to step into it that I'm broadcasting from right now. It was originally, of course, back in time, revolutionary times, Washington's troops wintered there, and before that, of course, way before the native tribes were there. But it was part of Convent Station. It's now part of Morristown, where I am. The Antaka Brook Reservation. This poem is called Antaka, the place of cold winter, the long-gone natives called it. Once a place of hunting for the Lenape, refuge for revolutionary soldiers, now an oasis for birders and walkers like me, disappearing under green canopies, reappearing past thin, rustling walls of reeds, to the still and moving pond, where a blue heron stilts about for supper. A white swan idles elegantly, nonchalantly. Dozens of swifts air dance after insects only they can see, and red-winged blackbirds Sergeant Major yes-sirly round the perimeter. Though I am the only visitor this sunset hour, far from winters and wars, cities and cacophonies. So in this reserve is this pond. It's a lyrical pond still then, and waterfall near that. My Walden Pond, I guess you could say of a kind. It's Kitchell Pond, but for me it was a kind of a Walden, place of composure and composing myself and poems. And I would always sit under this river maple at the bottom of the pond so I could see it all and the clouds. And I called that the poet's bench. This is the poem. Poems are made here in the sun, in the snow, on the wind, by the still and moving waters, seasons, wildlife of the pond, by a poet floating in the open air. Poems that open from the inside out are open to everything flowing outside in. Their landscapes communing with and without words at a simple bench beside the woods. So as we take this sunny and shaded path together, some questions. Forests, gardens. What's your relationship with forests, or a particular forest, with woodlands, with gardens? Your experiences, especially ones that may have or have filled or moved you subtly or strongly in your life to date, or in your imagination, or your dreams, or do now as we speak. You may live among them. What are those? What feelings arise? What about indelible memories, visual or otherwise? And what about your desire to engage more often, to commune more alively with them, in whole or in part, trees to flowers and all else? Do you have such desire, or welcome it, or want to deepen it? I have a feeling if you're listening, you probably do. So I encourage you, because it's so vitalizing. Things that we may want to, each of us, muse on as we float through this time or afterward. So, paeans to forests and woodlands up in Lincolnville, Maine, the Young's Neck Preserves. It was actually at Fernald's Neck. As I was hiking through there one Indian summer, October, a couple of years ago, I was so taken with all of it, and this poem came into me. It's called Over and Under. In the overstory, hemlock and juniper, sweet fern, hardhack, alder and hackmatack, blueberry, butternut, chestnut, sumac, witch hazel, willow. In the understory, mushrooms and mosses, curling roots and glacial rocks, blown down trunks, soft flowing streams of pine needles, florets of lichen, dark-lived burrows. In the mid-story, eye-bright flashes of sun on jubilant lake water, seen through silhouetted skeins of light-bathing branches. This wild and free body of showing, telling stories. Well, in the realms of ancient to present, and rhymes, maybe we could say, of a kind of forest. Pablo Neruda seemed a good choice on knowing the forest. Under the volcanoes, beside the snow-capped mountains, among the huge lakes, the fragrant, the silent, the tangled Chilean forest. My feet sink down into the dead leaves. A fragile twig crackles. The giant rowley tree rises in all their bristling height. A bird from the cold jungle passes over, flaps its wings, and stops in the sunless branches. And then, from its hideaway, it sings like an oboe. The wild scent of the laurel, the dark scent of the boldo herb, enter my nostrils and flood my whole being. The cypress of the guatecas blocks my way. This is a vertical world, a nation of birds, a plenitude of leaves. I stumble over a rock, dig up the uncovered hollow. An enormous spider covered with red hair stares up at me, motionless, as huge as a crab. A golden carabus beetle blows its mephitic breath at me as its brilliant rainbow disappears like lightning. Going on, I pass through a forest of ferns much taller than I am. From their cold green eyes, 60 tears splash down on my face, and behind me, their fans go on quivering for a long time. A decaying tree trunk, what a treasure! Black and blue mushrooms have given it ears. Red parasite plants have covered it with rubies. Other lazy plants have let it borrow their beards, and a snake springs out of the rotted body like a sudden breath, as if the spirit of the dead trunk were slipping away from it. Farther along, each tree stands away from its fellows. They soar up over the carpet of the secretive forest, and the foliage of each has its own style, linear, bristling, ramulose, lanceolate, as if cut by shears moving in infinite ways. A gorge below, the crystal water slides over granite and jasper. A butterfly goes past, bright as a lemon, dancing between the water and the sunlight. Close by, innumerable calceolarias nod their little yellow heads in greeting. High up, red copohues dangle like drops from the magic forest arteries. A fox cuts through the silence like a flash, sending a shiver through the leaves, but silence is the law of the plant kingdom, the barely audible cry of some bewildered animal far off, the piercing interruption of a hidden bird. The vegetable world keeps up its low rustle until a storm chums up all the music of the earth. Anyone who hasn't been in the Chilean forest doesn't know this planet. I have come out of that landscape, that mud, that silence, to roam, to go singing through the world. Thank you, Pablo Neruda, for that. Entering the Firelit Forest is a poem that I composed for Adam Van Doren's painting, Edge of Forest, 2013, as I beheld it. Uplit, firelit, ghostly, plumes of mauve and maybe borealis or Milky Way meld with auras of trees as I face first step into a painter's fairy tale story. Of course, I'm always spelunking for things, and brain pickings. I often go there at times for some material for us, and I have this on the secret life of trees, and I've actually read this book, and it's incredible. I couldn't put it down. It's a real page turner by a German fellow writer, Peter Wolleben, and it's the astonishing science of what trees feel and how they communicate. So Maria Popova of Brain Pickings opens it by saying, trees dominate the world's the oldest living organisms, and since the dawn of our species, they've been our silent companions, permeating our most enduring tales and never ceasing to inspire fantastical cosmogonies. Hermann Hesse called them the most penetrating of preachers. But trees might be among our lushest metaphors and sense-making frameworks for knowledge, precisely because the richness of what they say is more than metaphorical. They speak a sophisticated silent language, communicating complex information via smell, taste, and electrical impulses. And that secret world of signals is what the German forester Wolleben explores in this book. He chronicles what his own experience of managing a forest in the Eifel Mountains in Germany taught him about the astonishing language of trees, and how trailblazing arboreal research from scientists around the world reveals, quote, the role they play in making our world the kind of place where we want to live. So here's what he says in their excerpt. Why are trees such social beings? Why do they share food with their own species and sometimes even go so far as to nourish their competitors? The reasons are the same as for human communities. There are advantages to working together. A tree is not a forest on its own. A tree cannot establish a consistent local climate. It's at the mercy of wind and weather. But together, many trees create an ecosystem that moderates extremes of heat and cold, stores a great deal of water, and generates a great deal of humidity. And in this protected environment, trees can live to be very old. To get to this point, the community must remain intact no matter what. If every tree were looking out only for itself, then quite a few of them would never reach old age. Regular fatalities would result in many large gaps in the tree canopy, which would make it easier for storms to get inside the forest and uproot more trees. The heat of summer would reach the forest floor and dry it out. Every tree would suffer. So, therefore, it's valuable to the community and worth keeping around for as long as possible. And that is why even sick individuals are supported and nourished until they recover. Next time, perhaps it will be the other way round, and the supporting tree might be the one in need of assistance. A tree can only be as strong as the forest that surrounds it. Well, to me, that's incredible wisdom right there about community. I thought around this theme of ours of a storyteller, Native American storyteller Robin Wall Kimmerer, wonderful writer, very poetic. This is, she's sort of the Thoreau of botany. And she talks about how naming gives meaning to existence in the book, Gathering Moss, incredible book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, far more beyond sort of anything technical you might imagine. It's beautiful. It's a meditation, really, on the art of attentiveness to life at all scales. She has studied 22,000 known species of moss, so diverse and so unfamiliar to most people. And she sees that power of naming as part of knowing, and she comes from a long line of Native American storytellers. So in there she says this: a gift comes with responsibility. I had no will at all to name the mosses in this place, to assign their Linnaean epithets. I think the task given to me is to carry out the message that mosses have their own names. Their way of being in the world cannot be told by data alone. They remind me to remember there are mysteries for which a measuring tape has no meaning, questions and answers that have no place in the truth about rocks and mosses. Having words for these forms makes the differences between them so much more obvious. With words at your disposal, you can see more clearly. Finding the words is another step in learning to see. Having words also creates an intimacy with the plant that speaks of careful observation. In indigenous ways of knowing, all beings are recognized as non-human persons, and all have their own names. It is a sign of respect to call a being by its name, and a sign of disrespect to ignore it. Words and names are the ways we humans build relationships, not only with each other, but also with plants. Intimate connection allows recognition in an all too often anonymous world. Intimacy gives us a different way of seeing. Thank you, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I encourage you to, if you're interested, to pick up that book somewhere at the library or get a secondhand copy or a copy. There's another, an ecologist, Lauren Oakes, wrote this book, In Search of the Canary Tree. It's really about a cypress, the story of a scientist, a cypress in a changing world. It's about the yellow cypress. And it's very interesting. I'll just give you a slice of that. Both witness and survivor of epochs of change, the yellow cedar tree has stood sentinel across the Pacific Northwest, revered by native mystics and exploited by industrialists for its lush golden wood, its growth rings encoding a record of good and bad fortune dealt indiscriminately by the long hand of geological time. Kindred to the giant sequoia, it is not a true cedar, but rather a cypress, and known as the yellow cypress or Nootka cypress, after the Nootka Sound of Vancouver Island, where it first entered the annals of botany. Oakes, Brain Pickings, tells us, one of the science writers who can rise in her finest passages to the rare category of enchanter, made the yellow cedar the focal point of her research. And she came to these sort of conclusions. A forest is a concept. It's an actuating algorithm that we are catching at a moment. But the beauty to me, one of the principal beauties, is to try to imagine the stream of matter and energy through this moment, from where it's coming from to where it's going. So that's the forest. If fear is the absence of breath and faith is a positive force, I want to breathe into an uncertain future. If this tree species and all the people connected to it gave me one great gift, it is this: the realization that there's simply no imaginable tomorrow, no modeled future scenario, no amount of shade of red that could ever possibly nullify the need for unwavering care and thoughtful action today. To me, that is thriving. To me, in this rapidly changing world, that is grace. It is how I choose to live with what I know. Thank you to her. Well, there's much to love and praise about trees themselves, and here's Mary Oliver's poem, When I Am Among the Trees. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily. I'm so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly, and bow often. Around me the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches, and they call again. It's simple, they say, and you too have come into the world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. Thank you, Mary Oliver. Well, speaking of shining, there's a timeless gracefulness, isn't there, to cherish about trees, especially old-time trees. And this was at a beautiful country place of friends called Sunnybrook in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, many Junes ago, when I was looking out in the gardens, over the gardens to the orchard, and I saw this sight, this scene. It's called Three Green Graces. 3 ancient apple trees dance in the midday breeze sweeping over the lawn and lift their summer skirts to show us silver linings. 3 green graces, long limbs sculpted by seasons of country time, joined in a circle, offering their lovely shapes and still lush tresses and centuries of fruitfulness. The great Hermann Hesse talked about trees teaching us about belonging in life. He said, when we have learned how to listen to trees, then the brevity and the quickness and the childlike hastiness of our thoughts achieve an incomparable joy. For me, he said, trees have always been the most penetrating preachers. I revere them when they live in tribes and families and forests and groves. And even more, I revere them when they stand alone. They are like lonely persons, not like hermits who have stolen away out of some weakness, but like great solitary men like Beethoven and Nietzsche. In their highest boughs the world rustles, their roots rest in infinity, but they do not lose themselves there. They struggle with all the force of their lives for one thing only, to fulfill themselves according to their own laws, to build up their own form, to represent themselves. Nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than a beautiful, strong tree. When a tree is cut down and reveals its naked death wound to the sun, one can read its whole history in the luminous inscribed disk of its trunk, in the rings of its years, its scars, all the struggle, all the suffering, all the sickness, all the happiness and prosperity stand truly written, the narrow years and the luxurious years, the attacks withstood, the storms endured. And every young farm boy knows that the hardest and noblest wood has the narrowest rings, that high on the mountains and in continuing danger, the most indestructible, the strongest, the ideal trees grow. Trees are sanctuaries. Whoever knows how to speak to them, whoever knows how to listen to them, can learn the truth. They do not preach learning and precepts. They preach, undeterred by particulars, the ancient law of life. A tree says, a kernel is hidden in me, a spark, a thought. I am life from eternal life. The attempt and the risk that the eternal mother took with me is unique. Unique the form and veins of my skin, unique the smallest play of leaves in my branches, and the smallest scar in my bark. I was made to form and reveal the eternal in my smallest special detail. Beautiful. Thank you, Hermann Hesse. Out west in Utah, I was taken with, well, I'm always taken with trees, but I was taken with the trees as I was doing hiking, Park City and other parts of that part of Utah. And I would come upon these trees that had what, of course, you know what these trees are, the quaking aspens that look like they have eyes and other carvings, so to speak, but all natural. This is called the Tree of Eyes for the quaking aspens. August 2017, Park City, Utah. Tribal, immobile, pre-verbal, watching, witnessing, peering, black and bluely out at the passing animals and men, the weather, wild and calm, each other, unblinking, sunrise to moonrise, simply, silently observing all. You know, Hesse was talking about the noble trees, the old trees, and how they withstand all the forces of nature and other incursions and challenges. And he mentioned scars, and there's a beautiful old estate that I've walked many times and was walking here recently up the road. And I did this honoring back in 2017 for the grandfather trees there on this beautiful estate. English style, sort of big park-like English style, with great stately trees, both indigenous and ones that were imported by the heiress that had lived there back in time. And it's called They Wear Their Scars. They wear their scars with dignified bearing. Their once fierce, now faded slashes and gouges, breaks and heavy blows, like medals of valor, from their battles with the ravages, savagings of unkind times, indifferent elements, still standing, all greenly and gallantly, stout-heartedly, in the old low-cut meadow, under bountiful white clouds and constable blue skies on this soft and most peaceable mid-September afternoon. There's another writer, and David George Haskell, I believe he's English. The Songs of Trees is a beautiful book, and I think he's maybe got some things on YouTube where he speaks, or there's some excerpts I've heard. And he has a marvelous voice and style. It's a biologist's lyrical ode to how relationships weave the fabric of life. He said, we cannot step outside life's songs. The music made us. It is our nature. So he has this to say, we're all trees, humans, insects, birds, bacteria, pluralities. Life is embodied network. These living networks are not places of omnibenevolent oneness. Instead, they're where ecological and evolutionary tensions between cooperation and conflict are negotiated and resolved. These struggles often result not in the evolution of stronger, more disconnected selves, but in the dissolution of the self into relationship. Because life is network, there is no, quote, nature or, quote, environment separate and apart from humans. We are part of the community of life, composed of relationships with, quote, others. So the human/nature duality that lives near the heart of many philosophies is, from a biological perspective, illusory. We are not, in the words of the folk hymn, wayfaring strangers traveling through this world, nor are we the estranged creatures of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads fallen out of nature into a, quote, stagnant pool of artifice where we misshape the, quote, beauteous forms of things. Our bodies and minds, our, quote, science and art are as natural and wild as they ever were. We cannot step outside life's songs, as I just said from him. This music made us. It is our nature. Our ethic must therefore be one of belonging, an imperative made all the more urgent by the many ways that human actions are fraying, rewiring, and severing biological networks worldwide. To listen to trees, nature's great connectors, is therefore to learn how to inhabit the relationships that give life its source, substance, and beauty. Thank you for that. I actually had come across it when I called the singing tree, or a singing tree. It looked like it was singing. It had a sort of opening, and I stood there, and the poem sort of sang into me. The singing tree sings high-tenored notes into the white wonderland, calls to the tops of the neighboring trees, the beds of nesting birds, the brows of the winter clouds furrowed low in the overcold sky, rings out a clear, hearty voice of joy. Excelsis, I chance to hark to here in these canticled woods. And I can never not associate woodlands and forests, gardens too, of course, with birds and birdsong. And this was an ode to them, back actually in Morristown one spring when I was here. The birds are singing their notes, faithfully, mellifluously, over thousands of years, nightingales to orioles, robins to wrens, into the ears and hearts of ancient Greeks and Mayans, emperors and farmers, explorers and lovers, infants, poets, across a world of forests and fields, marshes and mountains, gardens, ocean sides, still, joyously singing. I wanted to touch more on this notion of relationship certainly with nature, certainly with today forest, trees, gardens, things in them, growing in them. And so let's speak a little more about a community with nature. And I was looking around and I said, wow, this is from the Druid's Garden. It's spiritual journeys in tending the land, permaculture, wildcrafting, and regenerative living. Very, very interesting. I'd actually seen something of theirs before, but they talk about, in the U.S. at present, for example, there's no concept of the inherent sanctity of life, nor the idea of having any kind of inner life, but rather the basic assumption is that trees and all of nature exist as a resource to extract and use as humans see fit. So let's think about what we know about relationships. So he applies that to the same relating: reciprocity, gratitude, care, and right action. So first, that cultivating a relationship with the trees and recognizing that the nature is not there to serve you at your own whim or when you want it. gratitude, a final core practice, is always working from that place of gratitude, thankful, and offering it at every interaction, care, fundamental to any nature-centered practice. And it's at the heart of transforming our world. I certainly believe that too. There's a writer, Harold Booner, and I think I've read something by him before, actually, a couple of shows back, describes new research on how the heart electromagnetic fields that demonstrate that our hearts project a measurable field, and this can be sensed by others. So we project as much from our hearts as we do from our minds and mouths. Well, trees are unsurprisingly good at picking up our emotions. I bet very few of us would have known that. Last is right actions, which matter in the world. And they're both immediate actions and then the broader ones in our lives. So the idea is to always act in a way that's reverent and respectful of nature, and especially the trees you're engaged with. So all of those are interconnected, and I thought I'd just share that on with you for the moment. And I have just one or two more things on the sort of forest side of it, and then we're going to slip into the gardens. Thoreau, of course, we had to bring him in. He thought of nature as prayer. And he has a book, The Language of Trees, and it's a selection of his great poems and meditations on them. He had a 2 million word journal, and there's a photographer who did beautiful black and white photographs to go with Thoreau's arboreal writings. But he said this: "In the street and in society, I'm almost invariably cheap and dissipated. My life is unspeakably mean. No amount of gold or respectability would in the least redeem it. Dining with the governor or a member of Congress, but alone in distant woods or fields, in unpretending sprout lands or pastures tracked by rabbits. Even on a black and to most cheerless day like this, when a villager would be thinking of his inn, I come to myself. I once more feel myself grandly related, and that the cold and solitude are friends of mine. I suppose that this value in my case is equivalent to what others get by church-going and prayer. I come to my solitary woodland walk as the homesick go home. It is as if I always met in those places some grand, serene, immortal, infinitely encouraging, though invisible, companion, and walked with him." Thank you, Thoreau. Well, how free we can be, eh? How wild in some ways, or more ways, or in touch with our wilderness in a forest or some sort of forested wilderness. And this was for my once beautiful, magical daughter-in-law, Elise Garling, because she told me a story about when she was from the Pacific Northwest, the Olympic Peninsula, and lived out there, and she would go through the forest, no clothes, on her own, and felt, of course, wildly alive. And I was so taken with that imagery and that idea that I wrote this poem back in 2003 for her. It's called Elysium. I think of you dancing across a forest floor, an ancient forest filtering morning light and the high-pointed notes of hidden birds. I think of you gliding through the sea of green forest, flowing with mosses and ferns, your bare, star-stemmed body, all cream and rose, mirroring the grace and joy of a doe as you move swiftly over the fragrant earth, so free and flush with life and loveliness. It took me to think also about, this is from a mid-springtime here back in 2018, but how much sensuality and sweet ease we can experience and sweetness when we, let ourselves sort of come into the arms of nature, into whether it's a meadow, a garden, a forest, a field. This is called You Wade. Barefoot, ankle deep, through the spring green meadow filled with sweet grass and dotted shoals of dandelions. You lie down, face to sun and bird-singing sky, in a pool of pale and purple ajuga. You let your eyes slip closed, your limbs drift, senses float in the shallows of the slow-tiding afternoon. You wade. I was thinking also about the change of seasons and how that changes how we perceive, how we see and feel forest and trees and gardens and landscapes, seascapes. And that's quite marvelous in itself. And to note those changes, those contrasts, those transformations, in the quality of light, right, in the quality of the foliage or not foliage. Also, when there's rainstorms, and that changes the nature of things. It darkens the trunks, for example. It's quite marvelous. I do a lot of visual poetry around all of these things that we're talking about, actually, especially landscapes, seascapes, trees, gardens, forests. This is called La Danse Verte, the Green Dance. It was from East Hampton, New York, one early fall. The lines of evergreens, youngest and smallest to oldest and tallest, on stage, en pointe, in the clear autumn light dappling through the parting clouds, in the cool autumn air flowing round their outstretched limbs, all dancing, this woodland morning, not nutcrackerly or balanchinely, just naturally, and so ecstatically, and so lightly, as if they might lift off in a breath from the earth, so evergreenly, as if to say, with their gesturing, rapturing bows, this is aliveness. All right, one more, and then we'll come to our garden time. This is by David Wagner on the forest floor. In this green shade, over the leaves and rubble of the fallen and still falling, over branches and tangles of tree roots, over whole stones and whole nurse logs, beneath the arches of ferns and the grottos of deadfalls, the moss has spread and deepened an underworld. You kneel here naturally, and the air around you yields to your touch like moss, as the moss itself will yield to snow and ice through winter to return as what it was. And the green air you breathe is yielding to rain softer than moss, suspended like a cloud. And moss, the only living substance here for which a speck of sky after the death of a leaf is not an oracular emptiness. The cold before the cold has no need to fall. It was born fallen and can live in its own light, by its own light. The closer you look at it, the more it changes to the landscapes of the earth. The yet-to-be and the dead and the newly risen merged into rootless lives, whose entrances, like your lost eyes, become what enters them, where all that endures is your bewilderment. All right. So, gardens, earthly and otherwise. On gardening and the secret of happiness. This is another Robin Walt Kimmerer book, Braiding Sweetgrass, the botanist and nature writer I was mentioning. Wonderful, another wonderful book. Again, very poetic. She said, it came to me while picking beans, the secret of happiness. So here's what she had to say in there. My children complain about garden chores, and as kids are supposed to do, but once they start, they get caught up in the softness of the dirt and the smell of the day, and it is hours later when they come back into the house. Seeds for this basket of beans were poked into the ground by their fingers back in May. Seeing them plant and harvest makes me feel good, feel like a good mother, teaching them how to provide for themselves. Maybe it was the smell of ripe tomatoes or the oriole singing or that certain slant of light on a yellow afternoon and the beans hanging thick around me. It just came to me in a wash of happiness that made me laugh out loud, startling the chickadees who were picking at the sunflowers, raining black and white hulls on the ground. I knew it with a certainty as warm and clear as the September sunshine. The land loves us back. She loves us with beans and tomatoes, with roasting ears and blackberries and bird songs, by a shower of gifts and a heavy rain of lessons. She provides for us and teaches us to provide for ourselves. That's what good mothers do. I was remembering the poet and gardener Ross Gay in his year-long experiment with willful gladness. It's called The Book of Delights. And in that book, he says, I don't know if it's the time I've spent in the garden, spent is an interesting word, which is somehow an exercise in supreme attentiveness, staring into the oregano blooms wending through the lowest branches of the gumi bush and the big vascular leaves of the rhubarb, and also an exercise in supreme inattention, or distraction, I should say, or fleeting intense attentions, I should say, or intense fleeting attentions. Well, he wrote this poem called Thank You. If you find yourself half naked and barefoot in the frosty grass, hearing, again, the earth's great sonorous moan that says, you are the air of the now and gone, that says all you love will turn to dust and will meet you there, do not raise your fist. Do not raise your small voice against it, and do not take cover. Instead, curl your toes into the grass, watch the cloud ascending from your lips, walk through the garden's dormant splendor, say only, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ross Gay. Well, I've often used metaphors to talk about people that I know or would like to honor, whether it's for a birthday or just because I love them or am inspired by them. And this is kind of a flower song for a splendid friend, so beautiful inside out. Her name is Rosemarie Bartol, also known as Rosebud to me and some of her friends. This was on her birthday of this year, and I made this for her and gave this to her as my gift. It's called You Are the Bud. In the vase, the petals and the stem, climber and trailer, double, treble bloomer, Greekly rodent, aeolically rodent, beautifully hipped, greenly leaved, ever loved, across time and gardens, the pages of poets, the canvases of painters, the musings and memories of lovers, all imbibing the delicate sight, scent, sun-stroked chant of the emergent rose, budding freshly into being. I discovered Bronson Alcott, or Alcott, who was the related to Louisa May Alcott of Little Women fame, and he was a progressive philosopher, abolitionist, education reformer, and women's rights advocate from 1799 to 1888 were his years on Earth. And he wrote, so the back commentary is right there in the middle of bustling Boston, where his young country was just beginning to find its intellectual and artistic voice. He set up a humble urban garden. And one May morning, a century and a half before bryologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who we spoke of, contemplated gardening and the secret of happiness, and before Olivia Lang wrote of gardening as an act of resistance, and Oliver Sacks drew on 40 years of medical practice to talk about the healing power of gardens, the 56-year-old Alcott planted some peas, corn, cucumbers, and melons, and then wrote in his journal, "Human life is a very simple matter. Breath, bread, health, a hearthstone, a fountain, fruits, a few garden seeds, and room to plant them in, a wife and children, a friend or two of either sex, conversation, neighbors, and a task lifelong given from within. These are contentment and a great estate. On these gifts follow all others, all graces dance attendance, all beauties, beatitudes, mortals can desire and know. My garden has been my pleasure and a daily recreation since the spring opened for planting. Every plant one tends he falls in love with and gets the glad response for all his attentions and pains. Books, persons even, are for the time set aside, studies in the pen. Only persons of perennial genius attract or recreate as the plants, and of books we may say the same as of the magic of solitude." Well, there are many unexpected places and times you can find yourself in a garden, aren't there? Such as in a bath. So I'm spending time out on Long Beach, soon add Long Island, and at one point I was staying there, I don't know, about maybe a year or so ago, and I went into the bath that I had, and it was full. It was a garden. The whole thing was full of plants, the draping and coming up from everywhere. And I wrote this poem. I just was so inspired. It's called The Shower Garden for Roger and Irvy Wu. You'll find this sky blue tiled Eden 2.5 salty blocks shy of the seaside, under the terracotta roof of the cream-colored house, the long-mothered and fathered house, the colorful place where healers and creators and lovers live, an inviting, surprising salle de bain, with a shower filled to the hips with plants and blooms of all kinds that fill the room with aliveness, the eye with tender greenness, the moment of discovery of this sudden bower with a pure and quiet delightedness. But finding it in a painting, I read you that about the firelit forest. That was from a painting. This is Klimt in his garden, and this was for Jasper Krabbe at his New York opening back in 2007. There was this painting of the painter Klimt in his garden, and I just loved that and sat down looking at it and wrote this poem there on the spot. Klimt in his garden. He moves in a moon-length robe through an evening green garden of quietude, with hidden feet that touch the muted grass and moss, his figure almost afloat under the first blooms faint and soon fragrant on the branches over his silent head and soft beard, without thought of brushes or canvases, only this moment, savoring the poetry of a spring night in his garden. How about places that we travel to and discover beautiful gardens or forests or woodlands? Once upon a summertime in London, I entered this oasis as I was walking back to where I was living. I fell into a reverie there, sat down. This secret garden I found is an early summer poem of cut grass air and bird song. The silky fragrance of tree blossoms, benches quiet in contemplation, a solitary book with a man unfolding and refreshing at 10 minutes to 6 on a green London evening. Well, I spoke for a moment about Olivia Lang, the writer-artist, and she wrote this book, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency. She also has a beautiful book on, I can't remember, it's about rivers, an incredible book. She's British. She says, can you plant a garden to stop a war? It depends on how to think about time. You think about time. It depends on what you think a seed does if it's tossed into fertile soil. So she writes this, gardening situates you in a different kind of time, the antithesis of the agitating present of social media. Time becomes circular, not chronological. Minutes stretch into hours. Some actions don't bear fruit for decades. The gardener is not immune to attrition and loss, but is daily confronted by the ongoing good news of fecundity. A peony returns, alien pink shoots thrusting from bare soil. The fennel self-seeds. There is an abundance of cosmos out of nowhere. Can you plant a garden to stop a war? It depends how you think about time. It depends on what you think a seed does if it's tossed into fertile soil. But it seems to me that whatever else you do, it's worth tending to paradise, however you define it, and wherever it arises. Well, Popov also had mentioned Oliver Sacks in the mix in that earlier snippet, and on the healing power of gardens. And it's really about the psychological and physiological constellations of nature. He said, in 40 years of medical practice, I found only 2 types of non-pharmaceutical, quote, therapy to be vitally important for patients with chronic neurological diseases: music and gardens. As a writer, he says, I find gardens essential to the creative process. As a physician, I take my patients to gardens whenever possible. All of us have had the experience of wandering through a lush garden or a timeless desert, walking by a river or an ocean, or climbing a mountain and finding ourselves simultaneously calmed and reinvigorated, engaged in mind, refreshed in body and spirit. The importance of these physiological states on individual and community health is fundamental and wide-ranging. In 40 years of that practice, as he said about the therapy, it was music and gardens. Thank you very much, Oliver Sacks. So I think about that, and every garden, every forest, every tree, everything has its own nature, its own character, its own story, its own energy. There's not one daisy is not like they may appear like that, like animals, but they're all entirely different energetically, story-wise, everything. Even though there's some consonants between them, every growing thing, including us, obviously. So why not? Why would it be different? So if we put that lens on it, I think you begin to appreciate more and feel more connectedness and compassion and a lot of other things, actually, about nature around us. So I felt that way about a weeping cherry tree in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, some Aprils back. The weeping cherry, the one weeping so pinkly, profusely over the old iron fence, cannot be weeping with anything but pure joy on a day like today. A made-for-April afternoon for every sidewalk and blossom-eyed sidewalker down Brooklyn Way. There's also musing for us and for this program on gardens and gardening and how the metaphors from it are many and endless in literature and certainly in my own and others' poetry around living, around growing and flowering and fruiting, body and spirit, and loving. And here's a poem from many Februarys ago, 1998. It's called Sowing, S-O-W-I-N-G. If I'm the packet of seeds, you're the soil, sun, and watering can. Here's another one from back in time, 2016, on loss I was going through in life change, relationship change, and regrowth, and realization. And it's called The Transplanted Heart. Mine requires another garden to grow in, thrive in now, and more than a lone gardener to lean on. Having graced but outgrown the last one, having moved past a frost of the last beautiful but suddenly, sadly, and ultimately unvisited oasis, needing deeper soil for its deepening roots, more room to leaf, branch, re-bloom out, more hope to be daily well-sunned and watered, more chance to be tenderly, lovingly nurtured, horticultured. Transplanted heart. This is one more on that wavelength. From my multisensory exhibition Behind the Curtain. I've spoken about it once in a while in different contexts, but this particular poem from there is I'd call it perhaps an invitation to experience a being, the garden of a being, if we thought of ourselves that way. I do actually think of myself as a garden of a kind, and I think of my life as a garden, and making sure I'm tending that garden beautifully, and the people in it are like the things that are growing there and are, needing my care to be healthy and belong there. And then the goodness of that garden, the healthiness of them and that garden helps the garden next door, and all the other gardens rippling out from there are affected. Yeah. So this is called Enter This Garden, where grows the exotic and ecstatic, the wild and the cultivated, deep-rooted, fresh-planted, the vibrant and delicate, fragrant, succulent seeds and bulbs, petals and vines, young and old, that thrive in this sun, in the free, flowering garden of this love. William Butler Yeats has a poem you may know or welcome hearing. Down by the Sally Gardens, S-A-L-L-E-Y. Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens with little snow-white feet. She bid me take love easy, as the leaves grow on the tree, but I, being young and foolish, with her would not agree. In a field by the river, my love and I did stand, and on my leaning shoulder she laid her snow-white hand. She bid me take life easy, as the grass grows on the weirs. But I was young and foolish, and now I'm full of tears. Thank you, Yeats. Donald Hall has his own poem about letting go. It's around the slow death of his poet wife, Jane Kenyon, or herself an incredible poet, to me anyway, and to others. It's called Her Garden. I let her garden go. Let it go, let it go. How can I watch the hummingbird hover to sip with its beak's tip the purple bee balm whirring as we heard it years ago? The weeds rise rank and thick. Let it go, let it go. Where annuals grew and burdock grows, where standing she at once could see the peony, the lily, and the rose rise over brick she'd laid in patterns. Moss, let it go, let it go. Turns the bricks green, softening them by the gray rocks where hollyhocks that lofted while she lived, stem by tall stem, blossom with loss. Mark Strand's poem, I Am Ever Affected By, and I felt so fitting for our program here and uplifted by. He wrote this for the poet Robert Penn Warren, actually. I don't know the backstory of that, but I'd like to sometime. It's called The Garden. It shines in the garden, in the white foliage of the chestnut tree, in the brim of my father's hat as he walks on the gravel. In the garden, suspended in time, my mother sits in a redwood chair. Light fills the sky, the folds of her dress, the roses tangled beside her. And when my father bends to whisper in her ear, when they rise to leave and the swallows dart and the moon and stars have drifted off together, it shines. Even as you lean over this page, late and alone, it shines. Even now, in the moment before it disappears. Isn't that marvelous? All right, so we're moving now toward the along on our forested and garden path to the last length, we might go a little over our usual time, but I don't think too much. Or I try to keep it in. So this is an old Native American elder story. It's called Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Talk about using the deeper knowing parts of yourself to gauge and navigate by and with. This is a poem from 2016. It's called Above the Tree Line. Down in the forest of pinon or ponderosa, spruce or juniper, you can't see the terrain above, what you'll encounter from the weather to the boulders, until you hike up through the tree line, past the last twisted wood. You can really only engage from here a way up, and only as you go. Apply your wisdom or intuition of the moment to your next movement up your mountain, to the ease or challenge of your next choice, chosen momentum in the now opened out air of your ascent. This next one of mine is a kind of meditation and certainly an evocation. You can let your imagination wander to beautiful places like these, often actually. Takes a little time to get into that rhythm, that flow, but once you're there, you don't want to not be doing it. This is called Rising to Now. Imagine half waking in a warm country bed, your eyelids filling with sun, your ears filling with foreign background notes of first morning birds tuning in the trees, your skin sensing a stir of tree-washed air as you bring your bountiful self into being and rise with grace and gratefulness to now. How about this poem of David Whyte's, with the garden as a place of awakening, of rediscovering? It's called Easter Morning in Wales. A garden inside me, unknown, secret, neglected for years, the layers of its soil deep and thick. Trees in the corners with branching arms and the tangled briars like broken nets. Sunrise through the misted orchard, morning sun turns silver on the pointed twig. I have woken from the sleep of ages, and I am not sure if I am really seeing or dreaming or simply astonished, walking towards sunrise, to have stumbled into the garden where the stone was rolled from the tomb of longing. Thank you, David Whyte. That's from his collection Where Many Rivers Meet. Lynn Ungar, the poet, Ungar, has this advice for us. And you, what of your rushed and useful life? Imagine setting it all down, papers, plans, appointments, leaving only a note. Gone to the fields to be lovely. Be back when I'm through with blooming. Thank you, Lynn Unger. Planting yourself is perhaps one of my suggestions for you, for us, and why not go there? Planting yourself in the earth, in your breath, in the morning light, in your heart. Each day a place, a chance to break new ground, root, grow, flower. So we're coming now to the very end. As we wind toward that closer closing. For now, a quote, a thought from Marcel Proust. Let us be grateful to the people who make us happy. They are the charming gardeners who make our souls blossom. So yes, attune when you can, whenever you can, to all of these dimensions of nature that we're talking about that are so often so close around us, or are not too far away to get into or be with. This is an ode to the green light, let us say. It's for the winter solstice. It's called Green Light. The light returns through the winter evergreens. Sun climbs again towards summer, does not disappear forever, nor all the other leaves, neither kingly oaks nor goddess birches, fallen but for a season. Sacred and hearty hues remind us of the life in the world before now and after, the length of an age. May ours be long. Holly invites us to wear its sprigs in our hair, its cheering berries in our hearts, bring to mind the year's ebb and flow of light and darkness, shelter the fairy spirits of the forest. Mistletoe speaks without words of the free and fertile, ivy to our innate tenacity, Scots pine, chieftain tree, sweetest of woods, dried and bonfired with the west windward juniper, point us to cleanse and purify, and rosemary, herb of the sun, calls us to strong focus and flavor, memory and resonance. Each and all, green lights for us to travel a winter with, accompany us a winter through, signal us in nature's form, show us the beauty, the enduring mystery of other anciently sacred realms and here remembered ways. And for me, we are all forests. Maybe we are all forests, vast, deep, and enchanting. Forests where ideas like trees grow tall, branch out, and bud, and feelings like birds fill the quiet air with song. And to remember it all goes on beyond us, or despite us, but also with us and around us. Beauty continues. Wild countries, armies, and ideologies battle. Bees make honey. Butterflies float and drink the nectar from gently opened flowers. While spouses, neighbors, bosses, and workers quarrel, the sun still sets and rises, brings color, splendor to snow-hatted mountains, old-growth forests, bird-filled meadows. The moon still shines upon the faces of oceans and lakes, fjords and flowing rivers, on fish-filled bays, clear streams and tarns, tide pools of mussels, anemones, sea stars. While attention's actions turn to ungraced choices and places of being, unlovely behaving in the world's towns and villages, houses, and metropolises, beauty everywhere, ever here, ever pure, continues. And next to last, as a fish needs water, as a bird needs air, as some forests need wildfire to renew, to reproduce, as all mountains and valleys need earth to become what they are, we need nature's elements, its daily nourishments, its wonderments, and wild firings of energy to come more fully alive, to stay alight, to grow, to thrive. And to end, the flower of your youth. This is flying west to east from California, February of 2017. The flower of your youth need never fade, can always be blooming in the garden of your heart, in the great oasis of your imagination, in the verdant gardens of the surrounding world, which await, invite, where you can always find and bring sun and rich soil, love and loveliness, where your flowering can be ever fresh and ageless. Thank you again for listening in, floating in, feeling in. And thanks to all of you listening ongoingly, my tribe and others, and to those sharing notes to me on how these floating poetry broadcasts touch or teach you. I'm always delighted to hear from listeners because I do create and present these programs to nourish spirits and uplift hearts and spur greater self-awareness and aliveness as much as I can. If you love this or another program and want to make a donation, I'd welcome it. In any amount at any time by PayPal or Venmo or directly through my site or just by email or regular mail rather to me at P.O. Box 1032, Westerly, Rhode Island 02891. If there are patrons out there interested in hosting me on a part of their property as a working poet in residence for several weeks or more, either later this summer or this fall or winter, where I'd bring forth a flight of poetic art and dedicate it to them, to you, I'd welcome a conversation. I do also seek out, as always, kindred fellow artists to collaborate with on projects from the musical to the theatrical, and producers, directors, and others seeking a deeply poetic voice and spirit. I will also soon begin offering a handful of images around each program theme as fine art, giclées on watercolor paper, individually signed by me, additions drawn from my body of visual poems, like the imagery that you see on for every broadcast, by the way. All of those are, if you're interested, you let me know. And of course, all the broadcasts are online as replays on my playlist on YouTube. I do hope you lean in again next week or soon again. Until then, dear listeners, here's to musing on the forests and gardens you've moved through in body or spirit, relating to them in sentient and reverent ways, and opening to their teachings, their vital beauty, their natural poetry. Goodbye for now, and good spirits.